Hello and welcome to the final episode of Renaissance Botany. In this episode, we'll talk about plants used for embalming in the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance era. The information referenced would be plants and aromatics for embalming in the late Middle Ages and modern period, a synthesis of written sources and archaeobotanical data in France and Italy, by Dr. Remy Corbeanu. In Western Europe, funerary cosmetic treatments are a common feature during the ancient Roman era as part of prestigious funerals, during which time the corpses were washed and anointed with fragrant aromatic herbs and spices. This was maintained for the aristocrats during the early Middle Ages, as well as the royalty. During this time, embalming was not a profession and was instead carried out by common doctors or apothecarians. The researcher hoped to figure out what plants were used based on French and Italian written sources that are collected in encyclopedias, treatises, and other medical books for medicine, surgery, pharmacy, and anatomy. These sources date between the 13th to early 19th century and include 17 embalming fluid recipes written in both French, Italian, and Latin. Some are rather famous in the history of medicine. For example, Henry de Monville served as a personal surgeon to the French kings Philip the Fair and Louis X, and another surgeon that wrote many different documents was Ambrose Pare, one of the most notable surgeons in the European Renaissance era, who also served several French monarchs, Henry II, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. Alongside this data, several archaeological dig sites have been dug up to find remnants of different plant materials in hopes of finding the plants commonly found within the recipes in remnant form. The sources used were recipe prescribed by Henry de Mondeville, which dates between the 13th and the 14th century AD in France, and is found in the language of French. Next is the recipe prescribed by Guy de Chaleck, which dates around the 14th century AD in France in the French language. The next is a recipe detailing the embalming of the Pope Alexander V, which is dated 1410 in Italy. The language is in Latin. Next is a recipe described by Giovanni da Vigo. This text dates between the 15th and 16th century in Italy and was written in Italian. Another document details the embalming of Pope Alexander VI in 1503. It was written in Italy, but it was written in French. Next is a recipe for embalming fluid by Ambrose Pare, written in the 16th century in France in the French language. Next is a recipe described by Ulisse Aldovandi, written in Italy in the 16th to 17th century in the French language. Next is a recipe by Clinto D'Amato, written in Italy in the 17th century in Italian. Next is another 17th century writing by Philibert Guibert in France in the French language. Still yet another 17th century writing by Jean Viguier in France in a combination of Latin and French. Next is a detailed embalming of Maria Anne Victoria of Bavaria in 1690 in France in the French language. Next is a recipe written by Nicolas Lemery in France between the 17th and 18th century in French. Next is the detailed account of the embalming of King Louis XIV in 1715 in France, written in French, followed by a recipe prescribed by Jean-Joseph Sue in the 18th century, written in France in French. And the last recipe was written by Gaspard Moray in the 19th century in France in the French language. Just using the text data, the most common plants used were myrrh, frankincense, benzoin, styrax, and aloes, alongside several mint family members and turpentine. A full list of species were listed in the image above. Now on to the archaeobotanical. The archaeobotanical data was taken from the human remains dug up in different parts of Italy and France. In Italy, bodies have been dug up in Sepolto, Siena, Naples, and Florence, and were examined by the Division of Paleopathology in University of Pisa under the supervision of Dr. Fornacari. Whilst in France, the bodies of Anne Delevé in Lavelle, France, and Thomas Craven in Saint-Maurice, as well as dug-up tombs in Flers, France, also provide good data on this topic. The 4 bodies were studied by the University of Caen in partnership with the CRAM organization, during which time they found remnants of both plant macromaterial as well as pollen remnants. And here was what was found. Based on the current information, most of the ingredients found within the embalming fluids created by these doctors matched up with the archaeological evidence, with only a small number of exceptions, which can be assumed to be substitutions because many of the ingredients such as myrtle or copaiba may have very well been too expensive in most instances and was substituted with other herbs, more local and easy to get. In many other cases, herbalists use generic terms to cover many different plants, like one name for one plant in herbology could actually refer to many different types of plants that were erroneously considered one plant, a common factor prior to Linnaean taxonomy. The body of Thomas Craven had remnants of Crepus species and a species of oak within its mummified remains. No pollen of myrrh, frankincense, benzoin, or styrax were found, which makes sense considering that the pollen would have not appeared in massive amounts, considering that this is a resin-based substance. As of the writing of this paper, no analyses for finding resin were done. Remnants of wormwood, chamomile, lavender, thyme, marjoram, sage, rosemary, mint, and myrrh, as well as styrax, were found within the tombs of all 4 bodies that were excavated. It is unknown if any of these herbs had the embalming properties necessary to slow down the decay within a dead body. But one thing that's interesting is that most of the soaps and perfumes use the exact same ingredients used in embalming. Those embalming processes may have been more symbolic rather than preserving. Well, that about covers everything. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching this video. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to me on BitChute for a greater variety of content, 4 videos a week. And thank you to all my subscribers on both platforms. I appreciate it.